value. So the Fed is designed to accommodate the politician in a very secretive manner. The politicians spend the money because the special interests come and say, we want this, we want this. The politician gets reelected, so he's rewarded, and the tax becomes an indirect tax. Instead of going directly to the people, what the Federal Reserve does is they can take a Treasury bill, accept the Treasury bill, which now is just a mere computer entry. They accept the Treasury bill of $10 billion. And they give Treasury $10 billion in their checking accounts. Where did the Federal Reserve get the money? Right out of thin air, right from heaven. They create the money, they put it in the checking account, and the Treasury spends it. And then that means that the people who got that money immediately get to spend it, and it has value. But as it circulates in the economy, the value of the purchasing power of the money goes down, and you have prices going up. The bad part about this is not everybody suffers equally. If the money supply went up 10%, and every one of us had the cost of living go up identically 10%, there wouldn't be nearly the great harm. But because of the system, it's designed literally to benefit the politicians and the bankers and big corporations, those who get the money. They get the money, they get the benefit, and then somebody else in a year or two or three suffers the consequences.
We read about the Federal Reserve as a banker's bank, and we see them that they raise the discount rate or they increase the money supply. What do all these things mean?
Well, the banker's bank means literally that the bankers are required to put their deposits in the Federal Reserve System, and they're accountable to the Federal Reserve System. They have to send in the reports to the Federal Reserve, and the Federal Reserve has all these regulations and rules, so they control the whole entire banking system. If in their efforts to fine-tune, although they literally destroy the money, they don't want to destroy the money. They want to control things so when inflation gets perking along, they're aware of the same economic thoughts that I'm aware of, and they know that if they're not a little bit cautious about this, they could have, runaway inflation. So they tend to back off. But they benefit from the backing off. That means they tighten the credit, raise the interest rates, and cause a recession. And they do it in the name of saving the economy, which they have to, or the currency gets out of control. But if they know it's coming, then they benefit on it too. Then they benefit. They know then to be in cash and earn high interest rates, and the banks benefit by it. So they, whether the economy is going up or down, if they're designing the policy, they can catch the swing. So it's the inside information that they have. But if they didn't give the recessions, which are literally the results of the inflation, the system would crumble much faster. But our argument as hard money people is that in spite of their arrogance to think that they can keep this going forever, and as powerful as they are, the market is more powerful. See, for decades they kept the gold price at $35 an ounce. They said, we will regulate the price of gold. But they kept printing the money. The market finally broke down the price of gold. Well, the marketplace will finally win out, and the people will wake up and say, it's all a paper, it's all a scam. And that's when there's chaos, and that's when the bankers realize they're getting out of control, and that's when the connection of the bankers to the politicians is critical, because then power is threatened. So that's when they come down with political controls of our lives. That's why the emergency powers are already written. The president can declare an emergency and take over the industries and take over our lives and confiscate the gold. And that's why we should be concerned. We should be concerned for, our prosperity, our standard of living and all. But our greatest concern ought to be that when these crises come in, the market disrupts this political system and this monetary system, then we're threatened by political power taking away more of our personal liberties.
Are this the FEMA regulations that you're talking about, the program?
Yes, it's done under the FEMA, the emergency powers, and it came up even in the Contra hearings that there were emergency powers written. As a matter of fact, that great hero Oliver North was participating in designing some of these to literally, if necessary, suspend the Constitution. Mm-hmm. These are the kind of things they're talking about. I don't know if you recall
set up concentration camps.
When this was brought up in the FEMA, in the Iran-Contra hearings, remember? They immediately suppressed it, and they say, this is something we can't discuss in the open.
Security, yes.
The people aren't allowed to know about this. Yeah. And that's why, who protected this information? Who protected Oliver North? The head Democrat, which goes to show you the power structure is the same.
John, you made a big study of the history of the Federal Reserve. How did it come about?
Well, it's a murky story, and I think that maybe 1913 ought to be the year that went down in infamy in American history, because not only did we get just barely in 1913, the Federal Reserve. We also got the income tax in that very same year, and those two things have worked to our really been a very negative thing in our society and in our economy ever since that time. But it was a very secretive thing. It really goes back to the bankers getting in a sealed railway car and sneaking off to Jekyll Island, Georgia. And it was a very secret meeting. In fact, they called it the First Name Club. They only called each other by their first name so that even people who worked there as waiters and servants and so forth later couldn't identify for sure who had even participated in that meeting.
Well, it was only about 4 or 5 people, wasn't it?
Well, it was about 10, I believe, or 12. And that group of people literally laid the basis for what became the Federal Reserve.
Basically Rockefeller, Morgan people?
That group, you probably know something in that area.
Colonel House was involved there, and the Woodrow Wilson people were there, although this occurred, I believe, in 1910 or so when they met at Jekyll Island.
Yes, that's right. It was a couple of years later.
By the time it got planned, it was finally passed in 1913.
It was kind of sneaked through Congress, and Wilson actually signed that into law, the Federal Reserve Act, like 2 days before Christmas. And when many of the senators and congressmen, of course with transportation in 1913 being what it was, they had long since left the nation capital, many of them, but the ones that they wanted to stay and vote did stay and vote. Wilson signed the law 2 days before Christmas, and traditionally hasn't that been a period where by gentleman's agreement that important legislation is not enacted right around the Christmas holiday?
It may be a gentleman's agreement, but that's generally the time that I was always most vigilant, because I realized that's when most of the garbage would be passed and most of the more onerous. You know, on the last day of the session is unbelievable. Stacks and stacks of pieces of legislation come in, and nobody reads anything. So the worst things happen at that particular time, but it is supposed to be that if the members aren't attending, that they wouldn't be doing these kind of things. But you're absolutely right. There was a very low attendance, and it was an unusual year because generally Congress didn't meet that late in the year, and I don't know whether they were called back into session what, but it was unusual for Congress back in those days. Now it's very common to meet all year round. So back then they were usually only in session 2 or 3 months of the year, but here they were in session in December. Very unusual year.
And one of the most important pieces of legislation, certainly in our history, kind of just rushed through at the last minute without anyone really paying that much attention to it.
And I think it's so interesting. There were a lot of people who weren't fooled. A lot of the congressmen from the western part of the United States, even the south, more populous areas, weren't fooled by what was happening. They recognized it as a gravy train going to the bankers, so they naturally were opposed to it. And in reading the book Secret of the Federal Reserve, I thought it was fascinating that the bankers set up an organization to complain about this Federal Reserve Act, which was which they secretly hatched up, and they were secretly trying to get passed. But they complained that it was going to kill them, just so it would the people would think that, oh well, we're going to pass this and it'll harness the banks.
Yet they were literally getting a license to steal, because that really permitted this fractional reserve banking system to occur where they can pyramid their deposits, loan out money that they don't even have. So it was a tremendous benefit to the bankers.
You know, nothing of this that you'll find in history books or books on government or the economic history of the United States. Nothing about how this came about.
We're certainly not teaching it in school.
Not in the public schools. Hopefully we will see that it gets taught somewhere.
Let's come forward from 1913 to the Depression era and the role that the Fed played in that, the inflation-deflation cycle. Would you like to comment on that?
Yes, a lot of people, and you can still find in history books that the economists were reassured in the 1920s that there was no inflation. Prices were relatively stable, and they always said that inflation was rising prices. But if you look at the monetary history, there was a lot of monetary inflation during the 1920s, and the money, instead of going into production, it went into speculation. Of course, it bid up the price of stocks and real estate, and then it finally came to that time when there is concern, or they make the decision, look, we think we can not only save the dollar and stop the inflation, but we can make some money on it. They say, we're going to have to turn this off, so they cut back on the credit, and it caused the stock market crash. And of course then the Great Depression followed. Previous inflation always leads to a correction of a recession or depression. But if you compare what happened in the 1920s, very similar to what's happening here in the 1980s, and you just think about how many times you read in the last 6 or 8 years that the government's told us there's nothing to worry about, there's no inflation. Well, there's been a greater expansion of money now than there was in the 20s. Of course, there was a greater speculation in the stock market and a bigger stock market crash. So I anticipate, and many Austrian free market economists anticipate, that the recession that's coming will not be a recession at all. It'll be a depression and probably be bigger than the one we had in the 1930s, because it will be the correction for all the malinvestment, all the mistakes made because of this artificial credit pumped in by the Federal Reserve System. So we have to look for the correction. The next president will be blamed for the depression, but it is that they shouldn't get to blame. It should be the Federal Reserve policy and the Reagan administration and the Congress today who have run up the debts and created the new money that has set the stage for the next recession.
The next recession or slant depression, if it becomes that, do you have an idea in mind for when that might begin? We see all these books out now, The Great Depression of 1990. And
I have an idea, but the most important thing about Austrian economics is that you cannot project precisely, because events occur with emotional aspects, human beings making decisions. That's why, although many, including myself, kept saying there's going to be a stock market crash, but I didn't know it was going to be October 19th. It could have been October 10th, or it could have been November 15th. I mean, it comes when people just get frightened and scared and panic. So Austrian economics teaches that, yes, we know a depression is coming, but we don't know the day it's going to start. But still, a lot of people say, well, what do you think? Because you just have to make a judgment for personal and financial reasons. I think there's going to be another major financial event before the end of this year, close to the election, more likely before than afterwards. And that by next year, next spring, it'll be very clear that this country is moving rapidly into a recession.
We put that question to Congressman Gonzalez, your former colleague on the Housing Banking Currency Committee. And I said, well, I've been reading a lot about how the next president is going to be the next Herbert Hoover. And he said, if we're lucky, the depression will wait that long.
Yeah, and I wouldn't argue a whole lot, but time is running short. Here we are in August already, and a recession could start tomorrow or the next day. It could be very clear. I think, matter of fact, the standard of living has been going down. I think history is going to show that the country has been down on the down slope maybe for the past 10 years. It's just not going rapidly, and it's not confirmed by the government statistics, but they're changing all the time. They use GNP figures to reassure us everything is okay, and 40% of the GNP is government spending, and where do they get the money? They print it. And also, like for CPI, they change in that. If it's going up too fast, they change the way they calculate it. But if you go to the average guy on the street and say, is your cost of living going up? He says, I can't even pay my bills. I'm not even buying steak anymore. And so things are a lot worse than the government would lead us to believe.
Can we get back to this matter of political power, economic power, and control of the economy? Were you in Congress when Wright-Patman was still there?
No, but I was in Congress when his son was there.
Okay.
I think it's Bill Patman that was there, but I didn't know Wright-Patman. Wright-Patman, of course, was the chairman of the Banking Committee at one time, and he had some good ideas about the Federal Reserve.
Oh, he had, in my studies on the American power structure, it was a real gold mine, because his committee, the one which you came on later, made studies of how the big banks in the United States control the corporations in the United States, and it's incredible. Through interlocking directorates and stock ownership, I guess, did you see much of this while you were there on the committee?
Not in the detail that he had looked at it, but it's obviously very clear. The one thing that I picked up from Wright-Patman was his bill to audit the Federal Reserve, and I only made minor modifications to it. I dug that out, and he, of course, was a champion of openness in government. He wanted to know what the Federal Reserve was doing, and he never, finally, I think in his older years, they had voted him out of that power position. Even before he was out of Congress, he lost his position. They put in Henry Royce, who was much more controlled by the banking people. But he was a good person, and he wanted more openness. I don't know if he was as strong on the gold standard as I am, but he certainly was against the type of banking system and how the banking system and the Federal Reserve serve the interests of the bankers and large corporations.
Did the